place, powerful social coalitions would seek to preserve it, and this is what happened. The Waqf has one key property of the corporation. It has an existence apart from its individual trustees and its employees and its beneficiaries. Once a Waqf is established, it lives, it has a life that goes way beyond the life of its founder. So it might have provided the starting point for corporate life. However, unlike a corporation, the Waqf is not meant to be self-governed. Legally, the deed of a Waqf, in other words, what we call the Waqfiyeh, is viewed as a contract between the founder and Muslim society. The Waqf's objectives and rules of operation are set by the founder, and in principle they are to be followed forevermore. Due to lack of self-governance, Waqfs tended to become dysfunctional over time. A Waqf set up to provide lodging for merchants. In Kayseri, let's say, on a trade route, it could not adjust. At least it could not adjust quickly if trade routes changed and the inns were no longer needed. So the Waqf system delayed the emergence of the corporation. It did this in one other way that I want to point out. Because of its wealth sheltering function, the Waqf system sucked capital out of the commercial sector. Successful merchants invariably set up Waqfs to give their families security. And in the process, successful merchants in the Arab empires, in Iran, and certainly the Ottoman Empire, they moved capital from a relatively flexible sector, the commercial sector, into a relatively inflexible sector, in other words, the Waqf sector. And they moved capital out of a sector where growing enterprises might have stimulated institutional change. So we've seen why the corporation didn't emerge in the Middle East. The initial conditions were different, and why its alternative, the Waqf, proved to be an inferior substitute in the long run. But identifying why a given institution was not selected in the 8th century doesn't explain by itself why it wasn't adopted later, especially if the choice created problems in the long run. The corporation could have been borrowed at any time from abroad. It could have been invented by people conscious of the limitations of the Waqf sector. However, critical ingredients were lacking for inventing the corporation and for making it work. These ingredients were lacking because of something I've already gone through. Islamic partnership law, in combination with Islamic inheritance law, led to conditions that made their development unnecessary, that made the development of large organizations unnecessary, or larger organizational forms that would be conducive to large numbers unnecessary. Members of small and short-lived partnerships do not feel a need to develop sophisticated accounting methods. Now that matters because it's difficult to raise capital for a corporation without standardized bookkeeping. Short-lived partnerships don't need tradable shares. People won't invest in a corporation without a way of giving their shares liquidity. The appropriate markets are simply not there. On top of these missing ingredients in the commercial sector, the legal system was unfamiliar with the concept of legal personhood. So for many centuries, the absence of these organizational advances, the absence of these critical institutional ingredients blocked one possible path to the corporation, borrowing from abroad. The organizational challenges were simply too numerous. So let's go back one last time to the origins and the divergence from the Western organizational pattern, and then I will wrap up. The Waqf in the Middle East and the corporation in the West emerged around the same time as I've pointed out. Both of these solutions grew out of Roman law. Okay, you may find also these elements in even more rudimentary form in Persian law, but Roman law was the main source of these ideas in both the case of the West and the Islamic Middle East. During the 8th to 10th centuries, the Middle East had quite strong states. You had the Umayyad Empire, the Abbasid Empire, the Fatimid state. Western Europe, in the aftermath of the demise of the Western Roman Empire, had weak states, very weak states that were unable to enforce law and order. So you get different solutions, different problems. In the Middle East, an organization emerges to a problem you would see in a society with a strong state that is capable of enforcing a far-reaching legal system, which is certainly the case for all of the states that I just mentioned, but is also capable of predation. The Waqf provides material security to its founder, security from a strong state. In the West, what you see is the emergence of an organization, the corporation, that compensates for weak states. Compensates for weak states in the absence of enforceable law, in the absence of law and order. The corporation supplies the means for self-governance in a particular context. The trust is also, by the way, borrowed by the Europeans. In Western Europe we find trust, but the role of the trust is much smaller than in the Middle East. The resources that end up in European trusts is about 1/10 of the resources that end up in Waqfs in the Middle East. Now, I've tried to convince you that the Waqf played a role in both the successes of the region and the subsequent difficulties. It ultimately became a drag on economic development, and this is consistent with key institutional reforms of the 19th century. Its historical functions were taken over in the 19th century by municipalities, by belediyas in other words. The municipality offers dynamic advantages over a Waqf system. A municipality can make its own budgets. A municipality can impose ordinances such as building codes and rules for using public goods. A municipality can reallocate resources quickly as demand patterns change. It can also impose fees on users or change existing ones. These are all things that Waqfs are unable to do because the founding deed may prevent it from doing so. So before summarizing the argument, let me say a couple of things, make a couple of points about what I have not said, what the argument does not say. I've given you an organizational argument as to why the Middle East fell behind. I did not, in providing an explanation, invoke attitudes toward innovation. I have not suggested, as many people these days do, particularly in the West, that the Middle East is underdeveloped today because Islam is a conservative religion. The region was not opposed to innovation per se. Adaptations did occur. However, and this is absolutely critical, during the second millennium, adaptations occurred mostly outside the private commercial sector. Okay. In this period, when the commercial sector is static institutionally, government organization goes through many changes. The tax system evolves. If you look at Ottoman economic history, you see repeated attempts to overhaul the tax system. Major changes take place. Muslim clerics, the ulama, went along with some of these changes. This is evidence that Islamic institutions are not inherently static and clerics are not consistently conservative. Commercial laws and techniques remained stagnant because private merchants and investors, until quite late, lacked reasons to demand the sorts of changes that led to modern organizational forms. There was no conspiracy to keep commerce atomistic, nor is Islam inherently hostile to commerce and enterprise. This is also an argument that is made quite frequently these days in the West, certainly in the popular American press that I follow. It's not uncommon to see in the New York Times articles, opinion pieces that suggest that Islam is hostile to commerce and enterprise. Nothing could be further from the truth. The founder of Islam was a merchant, and the vast majority of the jurists who shaped Islamic law invested in commerce. They had a strong interest in commerce. They had an understanding of commerce. Certain elements of Islamic law weakened the Middle East commercial potential, but this was not deliberate. This was not by design. The decline in the region's commercial productivity took place for reasons quite unrelated to Islam's original attitude toward commerce. So, to recapitulate, the question has been why, as late as the 19th century, the Middle East had no long-lasting and self-governing private organizations. This had become a cause of economic underdevelopment. Abdul Majid and others around him tried to break this vicious cycle, tried to introduce something new, a new organizational form, to broaden the organizational menu, hoping that others would follow, that Shirkat al-Hayriya would serve as a prototype for many other organizations, similar profit-making organizations. My explanation for the long stagnation is that three key components: the Islamic inheritance law, along with its marriage laws that allow polygyny, help to keep partnerships small and therefore to limit pressures for organizational innovation. Okay? Secondly, the Waqf served the institutional role that in the West corporations served. Many people had a vested interest in the continuation of the Waqf system, and Waqf sucked capital, apart from being quite rigid organizations themselves and prone to becoming dysfunctional. They sucked capital out of the commercial sector. And when large and durable organizations became essential, and when this was widely recognized in the Ottoman Empire and the rest of the Middle East, the corporation could not simply be transplanted from abroad because the institutional preconditions were lacking, and that too was a consequence of the region's inheritance system. I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you for this mind-opening and providing a new perspective speech. But I have still quite not understood why the Islamic inheritance system did not encourage or created obstacles or did not create incentives to creating large partnerships, because we know Islam is a pragmatic religion. I mean, at least we see this on many instances. For example, Islam has also a nominal ban on interest, but we know that it is practiced very well, and it has been practiced always. So there are always pragmatic solutions, and in the case of inheritance, there could also be pragmatical solutions, I think, because the ayats in the Quran, the two ayats from the Surah of Nisa, 11th and 12th, they determine the shares of inheritance, but curiously they have an intrinsic mathematical error. So in order to solve this mathematical contradiction, even at the time of Caliph Omar, there was a new method, pragmatical method was instituted to solve this problem, and it was called Avliye. I'm not going into the details, but what I'm saying is that first, those rules also suggested that the inheritance should be given to relatives only after the debts, all debts being paid. That's first. And second, since they had an intrinsic mathematical inconsistency, there could always be devised, I mean, new methods always could have been devised. So why the ulama could not devise some method?
Okay. Very, very good question. You make some good points.